Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Oh, we're having a feedback issue. Okay. Little feedback issue here at HQ. Dr. David Bain, you may begin.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about why killer whales and southern resident killer whales in particular need our help and some things we can do about it. So I'll start with an introduction to who the whales are. And it turns out that the genus or sinus, which is all the different killer whales, has a lot of variety to it. So I'll talk about that for a little bit. And then our goal is to recover southern resident killer whales. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means to different people and talk a little bit about preserving genetic diversity. And then I want to spend most time talking about what the threats are to them and what we can do about them in our everyday lives. Those are a lot of the little things. So we talk about killer whales dying the death of 1,000 cuts, and the cure for that is 1,000 Band-Aids, and all of you can do that. You don't need to be a heart surgeon to treat that. And then there are also things we can ask our elected officials to do, which are kind of too big for us to do as individuals. Okay, so killer whales are globally distributed. They probably originated about 4 million years ago, just like the genus Homo, which are all the humans. It looks like resident killer whales diverged from other killer whales in the North Atlantic. So even though they're living in the North Pacific now, they probably didn't get here till about 130,000 years ago. And our transient or mammal-eating killer whales were probably here for, say, 700,000 years. So our residents are relative newcomers. And once they came in through the Bering Straits, they would have spread out along the Asian coast and the North American coast. And then we had an ice age. And during that ice age, the southern residents probably would have gone south to California, where they still had salmon runs. And then what we now call northern resident killer whales probably would have gone to the Asian coast, where it was still warm. And one of the things we know about killer whales is that different populations eat different things, and there are morphological specializations that go along with that. And that means if you tried to hybridize with a killer whale that had the wrong jaw type, you might not be able to find anything to eat. For example, our resident killer whales eat salmon, which are relatively small compared to a whale, and our transients eat seals and porpoises and other whales, which are quite large, and it takes a different kind of mouth to eat those two. But if you had a mouth that was in between in size, you might have trouble being able to actually eat anything. So that meant that killer whales had to mate with killer whales like themselves. And after the Ice Age, it seems northern and southern resident killer whales didn't recognize each other as being the same species anymore. So we've seen reproductive isolation between them. Okay, so what does recovery mean? When we've studied how well killer whales will do in the long term, we found that the bigger the population is, the more likely it is to survive, and that makes a lot more difference than any of the specific things we can do, like changing how much fish is out there, how many boats are out there, things like that. The National Marine Fisheries Service, which is our federal government agency responsible for killer whales, would say they're recovered if we get to as few as 150 individuals. which could be something on the order of 90 mature individuals, that they would delist them. But we also have the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which says 250 mature individuals are still endangered, and even if you get to 1,000 mature individuals, the population is considered vulnerable. So that's a much higher goal than what our own federal government is looking for. And note for comparison is we think there are between 200,000 and 1.5 million sperm whales, but sperm whales are still considered an endangered species. So they're really setting the bar pretty low for calling killer whales recovered. And we'd really like to see much larger numbers than the 150 the government is trying to reach right now. And this shows trends in population. And the first complete census was done in 1976. And we've had fairly exact counts since then. And you can see that there are only 71. There are only 71 killer whales at the first count, and they increased rapidly after that. And one of the reasons they grew very quickly is that they'd been captured for public display to take to places like SeaWorld. So we're guessing that about 1960, there were probably 100 of them. If you went back to, say, 1760, there probably would have been between 1 and 2,000. So before this graph gets going, around the 1850s was really a bad time for killer whales. That's when people started gold mining in California. So people started tearing up the rivers there. And that meant the salmon that were spawning in the coastal rivers were having their nests dug up, and that kind of started a population decline. Another thing that happened back then is people discovered how to can salmon. And once they could do that, they could catch salmon and ship it around the world. It didn't need to be consumed locally. And that led to overfishing and very rapid decline in salmon abundance. Another thing that happened back then is people started building dams, and the salmon couldn't get over the dams, so they lost a lot of spawning habitat, and that also contributed to a very large decline. And yet another factor that got pretty busy back then was logging. So people would come in and they'd clear cut an area, and then they'd send the logs down a river to try to get them to a major city where they could either build new houses or ship them to other places to be used in construction there. And that had very negative effects on stream quality. And by the early 1910s, people realized salmon were in trouble. So that's a bit over 100 years ago now. And people started trying to recover them. But we've been doing more things to harm salmon than protect them. So their population has continued to decline. And we probably have fewer than 5% of the salmon that we used to have. And then another problem from the whale's perspective is a lot of the salmon we have today are hatchery salmon. And it turned out that when people were running hatcheries, they selected for smaller fish. So wild fish had to be able to swim way up rivers. They had to be able to push gravel around, so they'd have a red, which is the nest they laid their eggs in. And then they had to defend that against other salmon. So they had to be very large to be able to do that. But for hatchery fish, all you had to do was make it back to the hatchery, which is usually fairly close to the ocean. And as long as you survived to get there, You can just count on the person at the hatchery to lay your eggs for you and take care of them. So getting back early rather than coming back large and late was what was selected for. And a lot of the salmon we have, whose ancestors might have been 30 to 60 pounds, are only about 5 to 10 pounds when they come back today. So that means not only are the numbers way down, but the biomass is down even further. And the whales prefer the large salmon because if they can get those 60-pound salmon, they only need to catch a couple a day, and then they've got the rest of the day to socialize and raise their young. But if they have to go after these 5 or 10-pound salmon, they have to catch one every half hour or an hour, and that doesn't leave them time to sleep or time to play or time to get to know each other. So it's a big problem for them. So that kind of gets us up to this 1976, and then they were kind of left to do their own thing, and you can see the population generally recovered, and by 1995 they were back up at the level they were when the captures started. And then we saw a very rapid decline and hit a low of about 78 in 2001, and then recovered a little bit and dropped back down over the last 10, 12 years, and their population's only about 76 now. So, 76, even if it's an increasing population, is very endangered. So we're very worried about how our southern residents are doing. Okay, I mentioned genetic diversity is one of the things we worry about, and that's why recovery action is urgent. If a population doubles every generation, which is what killer whales do when conditions are good, 94% of single copy genes get passed on from one generation to the next. If the population is constant, which is basically what it's been the last 40 years, only 75% of single copy genes get passed on, and that means that since the captures started, we probably lost most of the unique genes that southern residents had. And then if a population drops 50% per generation, which is what it's been doing lately, only half of single copy genes get passed on from one generation to the next. And after a couple generations of that, you've lost 3/4 of the unique genes, meaning that it may take millions of years to get those back again. So if we want to preserve genetic diversity, we need to try to get a growth rate of about 3% a year. And that'll let us preserve almost all of the genetic diversity that's left. But the longer we wait, the more that's basically lost forever. Okay, so when we're looking at the main threats to killer whales, things we're most concerned about are prey availability. As I mentioned, numbers are probably down about 95% compared to what they were 200 years ago. And the biomass is down even more than that. We're also worried about disturbance because that makes it harder to find the little bit of food that is left, and it also means they need to work harder to find it because they have to go around boats and they have to search more carefully because they can't hear their echolocation signals as far away as they normally would. Toxins are another thing we worry about. Those can cause sterility and make them more vulnerable to disease. And it's a bad combination when your immune system is impaired by toxins and your population doesn't have the genetic diversity for a large number of individuals to survive an epidemic. So we worry about toxins a lot. Oil is a specific kind of toxin, but it's one that we worry about more than others. It's something that we probably haven't lost more than a few southern residents to oil spills, but the Exxon Valdez spill probably killed about 33 whales. And if you take out 33 of the 76 southern residents are left, that doesn't leave you very many whales at all. Incidental takes don't happen very often, so we're not too worried about those. But when you've got a small population, even if you lose just one or two individuals, that's an issue. And sometimes people innovate a new type of fishing gear, and they'll discover that they catch lots of marine mammals with it. And those gear types can be banned after that, but for a small population like southern residents, that might be too late. Disease is something that we worry about quite a bit because we've seen diseases like morbillivirus that can wipe out half a population, or we had some die-offs on the East Coast where it killed about 10,000 dolphins in a year or two. And it's not a problem with southern residents. And as far as we know, they haven't been exposed to it for a long time. But with climate change, we're starting to see southern species like bottlenose dolphins and common dolphins come up to Puget Sound. And those species are known to carry that virus. So we're worried that as climate changes, southern residents may get exposed to new diseases, and humans are going through the same thing. You may have heard about Ebola, which generally didn't overlap with the human population, but as the human population has spread, we're starting to get exposed to it, and we don't have the immunity to deal with it, and it kills a large number of people in the area that's exposed to it. Invasive species are something we worry about because they can change an ecosystem. And, like I've said several times, killer whales barely have enough food as it is. So if you have new species come in and reduce the food supply available to the whales, that'll be a very serious thing. And then I'll mention climate change, though killer whales probably don't care a lot about water temperature on the scale it'll change. Another thing carbon dioxide causes is ocean acidification. And again, that's something that probably will not affect killer whales directly. But salmon are very sensitive to temperature. So there have been some estimates that within the next 20 years, things could warm up enough that we'll lose 40% of our salmon. So that would get us down from 5% of what killer whales used to have to 3%. And if we lose 40% of our whales along with 40% of the salmon, that would get us down to about 40, 45 southern resident killer whales, and that could be as severe an effect as a major oil spill. So we worry about climate change that way. We're also finding that even with the level of climate change we have today, we've had the formation of what we call out here a warm water blob. And since that blob's been off the coast here, salmon survival has gone way down. And we've seen the killer whale population crash again as the salmon population drops. So even though the killer whales don't seem to care about temperature a whole lot, their food supply does, and the whales need a lot more food than they have now, not less. Okay, when I'm thinking about recovery, I like to think about it as a budget, and we can do nothing, and there will be consequences to that. We can do our best, and there will be different consequences to that. But even if we do the right thing, it may take a while for that to benefit the killer whales. So, if we went out and made 5 or 10 times more fish available to them, that would allow the population to grow quite a bit. Even if we only doubled the prey available, that would help the killer whale population grow for quite a few years. So there's a huge potential upside. But the things we can do to help prey recover will take some time for the whales to see the benefit of it. So some of the things we can do are tear down dams, which we did recently in the Elwha, and they're planning to do on the Klamath River in the next couple of years. And we're hoping they'll also do that on the Snake River, maybe in the next 10 years or so, but it's going to take a lot of work to make that happen. But even once that's done, the salmon will need to recolonize the area that the dam kept them out of, and then those fish will have to go out to sea and grow up, and then those fish will need to come back, and hopefully there'll be more of them when they come back the first time, and then that second generation that goes out to sea and comes back can be quite a bit larger. So we're looking at 10 or 15 years after we fix the habitat that killer whales will see the benefit of it. If we don't do anything about prey availability, we're likely to have a lot of potential for population loss. So if we continue to build dams and turn our rivers into cities and things like that, so the salmon population drops, there'll be less food for the whale to eat. And that has practical implications for how we live our lives. And the riverine habitat or riparian habitat will be very important. So that means whenever we build a road that goes across a salmon-bearing stream, we need to make sure that the salmon can get through that. And it also means that where people did not take that into consideration, we need to go back and fix it. So, things like removing culverts that are not fish passable, taking streams that are in pipes and daylighting them so the salmon can swim upstream are important things for us to do. We also need to be careful about coastal development because juvenile salmon spend a lot of time in nearshore habitat, and if we build docks and breakwalls and other ways of armoring the shoreline, then we destroy the habitat the salmon need to grow up, and if they don't grow up, they don't get big enough for the whales to eat them. I've already mentioned dam removal is an important thing to do, and urban development. And then regulating fishing is something we need to think about. So, we've been trying to regulate fishing to maintain a certain level of fish, but that level is too low for killer whales to survive. So we can scale back on fishing a bit so that they fully occupy the habitat available to them. But there's really not a lot we can do there right now. The other thing we can think about is trying to have fishermen fish kind of closer to the rivers than the whales are taking the fish. So that'll make it more fish available to the whales, and they won't have to navigate through the fishing fleet to get the fish they're looking for. Okay, disturbance is another thing that we can minimize. So Whale watching boats are one source of disturbance, but we also have a lot of commercial fishing traffic and fishing boats that the whales have to contend with. And we have some people who are just using boats to get from one place to another. And all these boats are making noise, and that makes it harder for the whales to find the food they're looking for. And in fact, studies have shown that when things get too noisy, the whales give up on even looking for food. So they'll just try to travel around until they can find a quiet place to look for food. And that's a lot of lost foraging opportunity for them. But disturbance is not a huge problem. So even if we ban boats, we'd only see a small population recovery. The good thing about addressing disturbance is the whales will see a benefit right away. For example, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, there was a suspension of shipping traffic because we didn't know what else was going to happen. And that made the ocean a whole lot quieter. And people were able to measure drop in stress hormones in right whales. And presumably you'd see the same thing in killer whales. And you'd also have fishing for the whales getting a whole lot easier. So things like that can happen very quickly. If we allow disturbance to continue to increase, we're likely to see further population loss. There are things like whale watching that will be regulated differently. And fortunately, our whale watch industry out here is following the science on disturbance and trying to adjust their practices accordingly. We had a project here that was proposed 15 or 20 years ago to put a gravel mine and then ship gravel every half hour out of it that was in critical habitat for killer whales. So that project was blocked to help protect the whales. Military exercises are a source of disturbance, and we've been asking the military to change their practices to minimize effects on killer whales. We did an experiment last summer where we asked ships to change their travel patterns to try to reduce effects on killer whales, and the shipping industry was quite cooperative with that. Marine energy production is something we're concerned about, so things like offshore windmills and tidal and wave power generation may be good for our carbon balance, but they create disturbance in the marine environment. So it's not the kind of thing we should be doing in critical habitat. And then we also need to be careful about researchers like me, because sometimes I do a study where I want to look at the diseases that might be affecting killer whales, and I go up very close to them in a boat. And then there are other times that I can do studies where I'm working from shore and don't have any impact on the whales at all. So disturbance is something I need to take into account when I decide which research to do. So this is what a shore-based study looks like. And I'm the person in the aquamarine sweatshirt, so if you want to put half a face to the name, that's me. And you can see I've got several researchers with me. The instrument I'm using is called a Theodolite, which is normally used by surveyors. It's basically a telescope that keeps track of what direction it's pointed. And then we do some trigonometry, which I guess the high school students in the audience would be capable of doing. And we calculate where in the world the whales actually are. And we've got a video camera connected to it, so we can record what the boats and whales are doing. And we can also figure out where the boats and whales are that aren't in the center of the screen. So this is the way we can study the behavior of whales with no boats around. Because if you go out in a boat to study them, you've already got at least one boat. Okay, let's see if I can make this work here. Okay, so it turns out the faster boats go, the louder they are. And I'll try to play a clip here for you of a boat that's going to run over a group of whales. So you kind of hear it starting up now off in the distance. Quiet background like this when it's going slow, the lower picture, and then the upper picture, kind of you see everything's kind of turning yellow, and that kind of means it's harder to hear what's going on. Bottom graph kind of shows you that a boat going fast is quite a bit louder at all frequencies than a boat that's going slow. Okay, and as you're listening to this, I want you to pay attention to the types of calls you're hearing and then how that'll change once the boat slows down. Okay, so you kind of hear how they did those loud screams while the boat was making lots of noise, and then, kind of the more relaxed buzzes they did towards the end. Okay, and we found that how people operate their boats make a difference. So what people used to do is they'd park in front of the whales and wait for the whales to swim by, and then they'd speed up and basically stay in the red zone. And what we found is that noise from in front of the whales interfered with their ability to echolocate much more than boats off to the side. And when the boats came up from behind, the whales felt like they were being chased. So it was a very bad situation for the whales to do that. So what we've asked whale watchers to do now is to stay off to the side and go about the same speed as the whales. And even though that means they're continuously exposed to noise, the noise level is a lot lower and changes the behavior of the whales less. So that's an example of things that a lot of people can do differently, and we don't need to wait for the government to pass rules about how to watch whales. Okay, toxins are the third big thing we worry about, and what we've seen is that toxins have a very negative effect on calf survival, and it also seems to make some diseases that whales might survive less survivable. The benefits of banning toxins take a lot longer, so it can be 25 or even 40 years before the whales will benefit, just because toxins take time to work their way up the food chain. If we don't do anything about toxins, there's potential for further population loss, and there are a lot of practical implications. Things people can do at home are use less toxins. So don't use pesticides or fertilizers or herbicides, because then you don't put toxins in the environment to start with. Things that governments need to worry about are things like stormwater management and wastewater management, how they regulate agriculture, things like product design, like do you put flame retardants in everything or just the products that really need them. Transportation is a major source of toxins, so things like tires have a lot of toxins in them that can kill salmon, and brake pads have copper in them that can kill or injure salmon. So, things like riding a bicycle instead of driving a car can do wonderful things for killer whales. And coastal development is another thing that can impact toxins in the environment. So there's a project going on in Seattle now where they're renovating the ferry dock, and one of the steps in that is putting clean fill on top of the seafloor to try to trap the toxic sediments outside of the biosphere. Okay, one of the things we've learned about toxins is that they're lipid soluble, and there are two places that whales have lots of lipids. One is in their blubber, and toxins there are relatively harmless. The other place is cell membranes, and that's where toxins can be very harmful. So we're finding that as whales don't get enough to eat, they lose weight, and they start digesting the lipids in their blubber, and that shifts the toxins from blubber to the cell membranes, where it becomes more dangerous. Okay, oil spills are another thing we worry about. There's not much potential upside since they don't happen very often, and we probably haven't lost more than a half dozen killer whales to oil spill. They're unpredictable, so we don't know when the next one would happen, but there is potential for huge population loss if we don't do anything to prevent it. So things we can do, or we have rescue tugs that try to prevent ships that are breaking down from running ashore and spilling oil. And we also spend a lot of time working on spill response plans so that if there is an oil spill, we can minimize the number of killer whales that are harmed by it. And I think we've only had one or two southern residents that we know of that have been caught in fishing nets. So preventing incidental takes is not something that has much of an upside. They don't happen very often, so we don't know, how long it would take for killer whales to benefit from a change in fishing practices. But there are potentials for huge population losses, as we saw with dolphins in the eastern tropical Pacific, where millions were killed. And the practical implications are how we manage new fishing technology going into the future. Okay, disease, is another thing that, we tend to have, we don't think of as a major cause of death, and they're episodic, so it's hard to know what the time lag would be. But there is potential for a huge population loss, and we're finding that a lot of the bacteria and fungus that we culture from whale blows are antibiotic resistant. So that means that antibiotics we use in the human environment are getting out into the whale's environment, and that means we need to be more careful with wastewater, which is things you flush down the toilet or wash down the drain. Stormwater, which is things that run off into streams. So it would be things like not cleaning up after your dog puts pathogens into the environment where they can get to whales. And if your dog was sick and you gave it antibiotics, then those antibiotic resistant bacteria that go out of the dog and its feces can get out into the environment. And that means that the whales are facing bacteria that were not only virulent enough to survive your dog's immune system, it was also virulent enough to survive exposure to antibiotics. So those are, kind of the superbugs that we really don't want getting out into the environment. And it can be the same thing for cattle and chickens. So you give them antibiotics and they develop antibiotic-resistant bacteria that get washed out to sea and can be a problem there. And then the other thing we can do is be prepared to give medical care to killer whales that need it. And we had an example out here with northern resident killer whale that was orphaned and had a lot of trouble with parasites and infection. So we captured her, gave her medical treatment, and then sent her back to her pod, and she's lived happily ever after. That was about 16 years ago that she showed up in Puget Sound, and she grew up and had 2 calves since then. So being prepared to respond to a disease is something we can do to minimize the risk that diseases will cause extinction. Okay, invasive species, sort of skip to the practical implications. Net pens are one of the things we're really concerned about. We've had Atlantic salmon escape from net pens out here, and they can potentially carry disease to native fish. They can compete with native fish, and they may even prey on native fish. So, it's another threat to our salmon population out here. And we've already talked about what impact on prey availability can do. Shipping is a major way for invasive species to get around, so how we manage ballast water is something that we're working on to minimize transport of invasive species. Offshore construction often changes the bottom habitat. So if you have a species that needs a hard substrate to live on, it can't cross sandy areas, but if you start putting things like offshore windmills out, then they can start living on the bases of those windmills and hop from one to the next, and they can spread to a much larger area. And eradication programs are something we can do about that, and a lot of people can participate in. But it's very hard to eradicate invasive species once it gets established. As the ocean warms and the pH drops, ocean circulation will change, and it's the ocean circulation that gives us the high productivity in this part of the world that the whales need. It can cause sea level rise. It means that a lot of coastal development will become undersea. So instead of having natural seafloor or roads and buildings, will become the new seafloor, and they'll have entirely different things growing on them, or perhaps nothing at all growing on them. And that'll make life difficult for the whales. Floods and droughts are very bad for juvenile salmon. We'll also see some changes in salinity, which probably won't be a big direct impact on the whales, but again, it can affect their prey base. The other thing we'll be looking at is an IceFree Arctic, and that'll open up things for species to start crossing between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and we don't know whether that'll be good or bad for the whales. Okay, I think I'll skip over the legal stuff and sort of hit the highlights of what government's trying to do. We're trying to evaluate threats, and I've talked about a lot of those. Kind of the key points they're trying to do is protect the good habitat that we have, restore the medium quality habitat to make it high quality habitat again, trying to prevent water pollution at sources. So that was things like the whale-friendly lawn and cleaner cars and things like that. Trying to coordinate efforts so that everybody's working together and doing things that individual groups can't do on their own. And let's see. So let's go through a summary of what you guys can be doing. For prey availability, personally, you can participate in restoration. Those of you who don't live near the ocean can make contributions to groups on the West Coast that are directly restoring habitat. And then at the government level, we can support politicians who support fish passage by things like dam removal and culvert replacement. When it comes down to disturbance, if you're going out in the water to watch whales, you can have the vessel you're on slow down and stay farther away, or you could watch from shore. At the government level, it's more things like minimizing coastal construction. There's a move to expand offshore oil exploration, which would be a terrible thing for killer whales. And also scaling back on military exercises in killer whale habitat would be a good thing to do. For toxins, you can minimize use, and for those living on the West Coast, you can try to put in things like rain gardens. Rain gardens will trap water for a while, and then the plants in the soil can take a lot of the toxins out of it before the water makes it to a stream. And then what governments can do are clean up waste sites, and they can do a better job of treating stormwater. For oil spills, climate change, and ocean acidification, things you can do are reduce oil, coal, and gas use. So things like turning down thermostats, improving insulation, wearing warmer clothes when it's cold, and lighter clothes so you don't need to use as much air conditioning when it's hot. Incidental takes, look for sustainably harvested seafood, and Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute puts out a list of various kinds of seafoods that are harvested sustainably. For disease, what you can do is avoid unnecessary use of antibiotics and try to plant native species. One of the problems we had out here is somebody decided they wanted eucalyptus trees from Australia on Vancouver Island, and it turned out that those trees had a toxic fungus on them, and that fungus killed people and pets and porpoises, and we also had a large killer whale die off at the time, so it may have killed a few killer whales as well. And then invasive species, we can end open water farming of species like Atlantic salmon. We can avoid importing species from other parts of the world, and try not to modify habitat in ways that encourage the spread of invasive species. So we should have a little more than 10 minutes left, so I'll try to get to questions. I see some have already been submitted, so I'll try to get to those, and you can type in any questions you have now. So, see, killer whales do not attack people in the wild. It's sort of a linguistic accident that we call them killer whales. Originally, they were named by Spanish whalers, and they were called whale killers. And it turns out the order of nouns and adjectives is the opposite in Spanish as it is in English. So somebody translated one word at a time and came up with killer whale rather than whale killer. So, they're not like, killer bees or something like that that might cause human deaths. No, killer whales won't get addicted to drugs. By the time they get out to the ocean, the concentrations are too low. What we are worried about is the antibiotic-resistant bacteria and fungus. One, because those are likely to be more dangerous to the whales. And second, if we try to treat a sick one, the bacteria are already resistant to the antibiotic we use, we won't be able to make them better. And it may take us a little while to find the right antibiotic for them. Killer whales can be rescued, and the earlier we start, the better. I've been involved in 2 successful killer whale rescues, and they both involved providing care while they were still in the water. There's been, I think, 2 or 3 successful rescues of killer whales that washed up on a beach, but killer whales are big animals, so when they're on the beach, their weight tends to crush their organs, and they can be seriously injured by that. Killer whales normally have 1 baby at a time. Twins are very rare, and if they have twins, they're unlikely to survive. We did have 1 pair of whales we thought were twins, but we did genetic tests, and it turned out that one of the whales had been adopted. So that, if they survived the first year of life with their mother, then another female can adopt them and raise them to adulthood. So that's sort of how they normally do it. They normally go about 4 years between calves. Some of the young ones can have calves that survive every 2 years, and then the older females may go 10 years between having calves. I live in Bothell, Washington, which is just outside Seattle. So I'm on those salmon streams that feed the whales, and I spend a lot of my time helping to improve the waterways here to help keep the salmon numbers up. For keeping track of the whales, they all look different, so we can tell who's who by looking. They also all sound different, so we can listen to their sounds, and that means we can put hydrophones out, which are just underwater microphones that are connected to a recorder, and then if a whale swims by making noise, we can tell who that is. So killer whale researchers tend to be pretty wimpy, so we like to work in Puget Sound in the summer where it's like working on a lake, and we don't like to go out in the real ocean, especially in the winter when things are pretty stormy. But we can put our hydrophones out and listen to the whales swim up and down the coast. And by listening to the whales migrate back and forth is how we learn a lot about where they go in the winter. Another approach to keeping track of them was putting a satellite tag. So that's kind of like sticking a Fitbit on them that has a transmitter that connects to a satellite and sends information back to your office. But we had 1 whale die from an infection associated with that. So we've stopped doing that with southern residents. There are such things as albino orcas. There's a disease called Chediak-Higashi syndrome, and we had a line of transient killer whales that we used to call MPOD that had a couple generations of white whales in it. There's also a resident type whale in Russia that people call Snowball that's all white. Let's see, killer whales in general are not very aggressive, but they are sometimes. For example, one of the ways we know who we're looking at is by the scars on their backs that other whales put there. But there's a limit on how aggressive they can be, because if one whale tries to bite another, or at least with the fishing whales, it's the whale that does the biting that's likely to get more seriously hurt than the whale that's bitten. So they kind of get mad at each other, and you might have a quick fight, and then everything's settled, and they get along fine for the next few years till they get mad about something else. Let's see. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time in the mountains watching birds, so I got used to looking at things and noticing behavior and listening to the sounds they make. And when I started college, the college I went to had month-long independent study projects where we could study whatever we wanted. So I decided I would study killer whales for a month, and decided I really liked it. So I stuck with it for another 40 years. I sort of say killer whales are complicated enough to be interesting. So, they have these very interesting sounds and social structure and evolutionary patterns, but they're simple enough that we can figure out what they're doing. Okay, let's see, we've got a couple minutes left here. Let's see. Well, there was an Endangered Species Act till the mid-1970s, and southern resident killer whales weren't recognized as a listable species until a little more than 10 years ago. So they were on the endangered species list, I think it was around the end of 2005. But their population probably dropped to the point that they were endangered by the late 1800s. So if we knew then what we know now, we probably would have considered them an endangered species perhaps as long as 150 years ago. There are 76 southern resident killer whales left. We don't know about any triplets. An interesting question: can whales camouflage or blend in the ocean? And I would say they try to do the opposite. They're designed to be seen. So they have, these big black and white color patches on them that are very easy to see. But I do think they try to be confusing. So, for example, if you had two whales swimming side by side, you'd see, a white patch with a black space in between, and a white patch, and then the open water in between, which would look black, and a white patch. So if you're a fish looking at that, it's going to be very hard to tell, which pair of eye patches is the safe spot with water and which pair of eye patches has a mouth in between. Also, if you look at the saddle pattern, it's very much like looking at the tail flukes. So it's kind of hard to tell if you're looking at a whale from above that's going forward, or say from right to left, or you're looking from beneath the whale that's going from left to right. So that makes it hard for whales to avoid each other. See, for color vision, we don't think they see color very well. They do have some oil droplets in their eyes that may give them a little bit of color vision, and it may polarize the light vision, and it may polarize the light so they can tell which direction the sun is even when it's cloudy. But they just have rods. They don't have the cones that mammals with color vision use to see colors. Okay, for flopped over dorsal fins, the fins flop over when they get soft, and there are two ways that can happen. One is they're growing really fast, and the other is they get sick. And because killer whales in captivity are fed really well, the adolescent males grow really fast and their fins get soft. Whales in the wild don't grow fast enough for that to happen, but they do get sick. So you'll see some wild whales that have been sick that'll have flopped over fins. The other thing that can happen with wild whales is they'll get shot, and those gunshot wounds will weaken the fin and it'll flop over. Adoption happens sometimes, but not always. Number of whales in a pod can be anywhere from 3 to something in the 60s. See, female killer whales can probably live into their 80s, and there may be one killer whale in the world that's about 100, but they don't live to be 100 very often. Males probably live into their 50s, but it also depends a lot on the conditions they're living in. Like, conditions for southern residents now are pretty bad, and most killer whales die in the first year of life, and the ones that do survive the first year only have a life expectancy of another 20 to 30 years. So that's changed a lot since we started studying them. And males are bigger than females. And I see it's after 9 o'clock, so I would guess we're out of time. So thank you everybody for listening, and hopefully you can get to work on some of these things you can do. And even the first graders among you can do important things. Like, we had a first grade class out here that asked their state senator to help protect a river, and she was so impressed by their letters that she traveled 75 miles to visit the class, and had the students personally read each letter to them. And then she went back to the state capitol and raised $1 million for the project the students asked for. So, those of you on the West Coast can try to do the same thing for your local river, and those of you in the Midwest can talk to your congresspeople and senators and try to get them to fund salmon and killer whale recovery. So, thank you very much, everyone.